I'm John Byrne with AML RightSource, and we have a very special conversation today with two individuals that have long been involved in the AML-CFT sanctions space. And interestingly enough, they are brother and sister. So really happy today to have with us Alison Jimenez, who is with Dynamic Securities Analytics. She's got a broad economics background. She's also works with expert witness work, training, and I've been fortunate to be involved with her with some conferences. And Steve Kemmerling. Steve, Alison's brother. Steve is the founder and CEO of CRB Monitor, formerly MRB Monitor, also with a economics and related background. So both of them have keen understanding of the use of data and other analytics as we try to navigate the AML-CFT sanctions space, especially with all the global challenges that exist. But I thought it'd be interesting and kind of fun to first talk to both of you about how you got involved in this space. Now, neither of you is as old as I am, and so I fell into this decades ago. But obviously, you've been involved in the AML space. Well, I'll let you tell us how. But why this space? And just given, Alison, start with you. Given your background, it's an area now that I hope people think it's a career path, as an opportunity to do some really good stuff and help communities. But I would imagine when you first looked at this, I don't want to say you fell into it, but what attracted you to this space?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I did get my undergrad and eventually graduate degree in economics. And who hires a 22-year-old economist? The government. So I first had an internship with the South Carolina Senate Finance Committee when I was an undergrad, and then moved to Florida, and I got my first job as a securities regulator in the state of Florida, which, again, this was before there were any AML laws specific to securities firms. It was before 9/11, before the expanded, Patriot Act. So I was doing work that touched on AML, but there wasn't the rules. So there were still Ponzi schemes, there was still fraud, but there was just a different structure, and it was more of a consumer protection type role. But for me, I always liked looking at the numbers and following the numbers. That's the part that I could really dig into. And probably my background in economics was, training me to do that part probably better than someone who could really read a policy and procedure and say, this language is vague, but throw the numbers at me and I could, work with those very well. And then I went to work in-house at a large financial institution, oddly enough, in their legal department. I'm not a lawyer, but, financial institutions, if you're large enough, you're going to get sued by, your customers, by former employees, by competitors, and they need someone to do the math for those lawsuits. And that was my job. For 3 years, I was the financial analyst for lawsuits, basically to figure out how much money was lost, or did we lose money? How much money did we lose? Where did the money go? If it was some sort of Ponzi scheme or scam. And I did that quantitative analysis, which on occasion I've had to testify about. So that's how I started doing expert testimony work, was in-house for a firm that they just needed someone to testify about the numbers. I went on my own doing the same type of work, basically quantitative damages for securities litigation. A couple of years in, someone reached out to me who knew I was a former securities regulator and said, "Hey, we have this new AML audit thing we're required to do. Can you do it?" And I said, "Sure." And then I went and said, "What's AML?" And went to my first AML conference and got certified. But it wasn't foreign. The rules were different, but the concept of following money, having, policies and procedures, knowing who you're working with, those laws came to effect, but it wasn't like a foreign concept to me. So then, since then, that was years and years ago, a lot of my work is doing compliance consulting, maybe working on risk assessment tools, taking that quantitative understanding of how do you put a rule into math, or if there was some sort of business email compromise, where did the money go? How was it transferred? Where did it go from wire to crypto back into cash? So that part that's where my strongest skill set is. But I've been doing this so long, I've had my finger in a lot of different areas of the AML space. So that's kind of my journey into AML.
Well, I'm going to come back with you in a bit, and we're going to talk about what's going on in the financial space regarding cryptocurrency, regarding, I know, a space that you're well versed in, and that's the human smuggling, trafficking area, extortion. All of this does demand an understanding of data besides what are the laws and regulations. So I think that becomes particularly important. Steve, looking at your background, you were an investment banker. You sort of bill yourself now rightly as a reg tech entrepreneur. You founded, as I said, at the beginning of this MRB Monitor back in, I think, 2014. So it's been almost, a little over a decade. I've been fortunate to see you present a number of times, and we did a podcast a few years ago. Same sort of general question about how did you get into this space? Obviously, again, you were in banking. Like Alison, obviously, you had that background, so it's not strange to transition to a part of that community because it's the adjacencies are all connected, whether it's fraud or what have you. But tell us a bit about that, because you clearly now are seen as an expert in this space, both again in the crypto space now and of course the cannabis space. And I've again been fortunate enough to be at conferences and panels with you that are AML centric, but care about these things because they're either directly relevant or they're adjacent. So fascinated again that Alison's career path. What about yours?
Yeah, thank you for having me, John. It's a lot of fun having had the opportunity to work with my sister. I did work with her for I think 2 to 3 years at Dynamic Securities Analytics shortly after she started it. Which kind of jumps ahead. So that's kind of, but we weren't really doing a lot of AML work, like she said. We were when she left the large broker dealer and started in house, on her own. I had worked at that point. I'd worked at 2 investment banks previously, so I came with a lot of finance and financial analytics background that was complementary to the type of work that Alison was doing. And so again, kind of the Venn diagram is in the M&A investment banking world that I worked in. I worked in industry specific verticals. So I worked in oil and gas. We had oil and gas databases. And then I worked in FIG or bank M&A. So we had bank databases. And those are the 2 I had started working first. Then I worked Valley in the obviously data specific kind of analysis. Worked there for a couple of years, and then went back to investment banking again for 2 other firms. Basically, the common thread throughout all my investment banking was using industry-specific databases to understand who were the players, what's the market dynamics, who's buying who, what's this company worth, et cetera, et cetera. So when cannabis started percolating in, kind of 2010-ish, really, when I started looking at it, it was more 2012, 2013. And I was looking at this brand new industry that had no data on it. So I was really viewing it from the lens of an investment banker, not AML at all. But it was, we'll use the M word, was marijuana, right? So the marijuana is technically, still today, as it was then, technically federally legal. Therefore, the federally legal drug trafficking. Therefore, all proceeds derived from federally legal drug trafficking are technically money laundering. But this was, so really it was kind of the Venn diagram of my experience of, hey, here's a new industry without a database. It also happens to be federally illegal, but I think at the time 10 states had legalized marijuana. And this one, FinCEN had come out with marijuana banking guidance. And their marijuana banking guidance said, use publicly available information and databases to understand the nature of the businesses you're working with. Are they licensed? Who owns them? If they got in trouble? So then that kind of Venn diagram, plus Allie talking to me about all my business ideas, like, well, there's an AML perspective here. It's kind of this triple Venn diagram that got to where we are today, such that we've developed the most, what I believe to be the most comprehensive database on the marijuana industry. And we help banks manage AML and regulatory risks. And they're still not really using the data the way I intended it originally, which was capital allocation, lending, equity, M&A. Not yet, because the industry is still illegal. But then that also led, what we figured out was how to build databases from opaque emerging industries that had no taxonomies, had no definitions, right? So it all starts with policies. And then my big bank clients came to say, hey, you figured out cannabis, can you apply that similar knowledge to crypto? So it's still kind of AML tangential, but it's more of a corollary than kind of the primary cause.
I just remember when I first met you at one of these conferences and you described your company, I said, why would people want that data? Because it's, as you just said, it's illegal, what have you. And obviously, your data, and I'm simplifying this to a great deal, and I want you to amplify it. But you talk about the direct activity with cannabis, indirect, several, in terms of companies that you might work with, some of their materials might be used for this, all that sort of stuff. And you obviously give financial institutions all the information they need to make the decision. So you're not taking a position, rightly or wrong, you should bank cannabis, you shouldn't. You're saying, if you're going to look at this space at all, here's the data you need to make those decisions. Is that sort of is that a fair way to describe? I know it's a lot more detailed than that, but you do show all these areas where there can be issues when you got to figure them out. But basically, they hire you to say what's out there, and then they make the decision. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's both complex and it's not. It's either your marijuana, we call them cannabis cautious, right? We have a
Right.
policy to not knowingly bank marijuana, cannabis. And by the way, for anyone listening, marijuana equals cannabis. At least when you talk to me, it does. But they mean the same thing now. But it's one data asset. So when I was first banking, I built CRB Monitor to help banks that want to bank marijuana follow FinCEN guidance. But that's 5% of banks. So 95% of the time I was talking to banks, and they're like, well, I kind of have this opposite use case. I want to make sure that we don't inadvertently have exposure. So again, the methodology was, we wrote an ACAMS today, defining marijuana-related businesses. I'm fairly well known for that, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So first you create kind of this out-of-the-box rough policy. I know not everybody uses it, but like, what is marijuana business? And then we say, okay, now that we defined it, here they are, right? So depending on your risk appetite. But yeah.
I'm just going to jump in with the analogy when I explain what Steve does to other folks. I said, well, if you say, well, we don't bank people on the sanctions list, if you don't check the sanctions list, how do you know you don't bank them? So if you say don't bank marijuana, then you need to know who the marijuana customers are. And if you're on the opposite end saying we do, well, we would make sure that they actually have the license they're alleging to have and things like that. But that's, again, taking what he does and simplifying, something more complex.
Yeah, that obviously makes it very clear. Just a high-level question, Steve. Your client base, all size institutions, generally?
Yeah, we have 3 of the big 4 banks, about to be 4 of the big 4, and we have $50 million credit unions. It's the same problem. It's an information problem. So
sure.
Regardless of the size of your institution, you just need to know what is the universe of relevant entities. So, but yeah, it's global too. We have Hong Kong, London, US, Canada, but it's mainly US and Canada and European focus, given the footprint of marijuana. But crypto is different, not to lead too much, but crypto is obviously much more global phenomenon than marijuana.
I'll come back to both of you on crypto, but Alison, I want to go to you now. I saw something that you, as we're recording this, posted in the past day or so. FinCEN in early March issued a geographic targeting order in the southwest border, and you opined that, given that that's where the focus is of that GTO, is this an area where it's being done specifically to deal with human smuggling? I want you to comment on that a little bit, but then I also, just in general, in the space of human trafficking, how important, I've interviewed folks from Polaris a few times, we've had webinars, that sort of thing. How important is data in that space? But just talk a little bit about the GTO and your thoughts, and then just more broadly about human trafficking and smuggling and the importance of data analytics in that area.
Sure. And thanks for breaking up the human smuggling. It's often the redheaded stepchild of human trafficking, they're both important, but human smuggling, I think there is actually less data, and that's something I dove into a few years ago. Human smuggling was just added as a category to the suspicious activity report back in 2018. So before then, there was occasional FinCEN, advisory, but not much ongoing data. And that's something I've looked at, looking at who files the SARs. Are they geographically based? Is it MSBs? Is it banks? And hint, it's MSBs. Banks are hardly filing any. And trying to peel back the opaqueness on the smuggling, which smuggling, just to clarify for folks tuning in, is if a migrant willingly wants to cross borders into a different country, and they are paying for assistance to do that. That is, sometimes it's called migrant smuggling because it's a little bit separates mentally from human trafficking, which is against someone's will where they're forced to do labor, whether it's manual labor or sexual slavery. So the migrant smuggling caught my attention. A couple of years ago, there was massive migrant deaths crossing the border, getting stuck in air-conditioned trucks or drowning crossing the Mediterranean. And these folks were also paying their smugglers tens of thousands of dollars in certain instances. But no one was really looking at how the funds were flowing. How were they paying? And that's something that I wrote about and that I republished when that GTA came out, because a lot of the migrant smuggling is along the southwest border, not all, but right. Very much of it. And migrants, they will choose to pay in segments because we pay all up front. Well, then they just won't transport you. If you promise to pay at the end, then you might get stuck into a human trafficking. Well, I don't have the money to pay. Now I'm forced to engage in prostitution. Now I'm forced to work at an unlicensed marijuana farm in the middle of nowhere. So there are a lot of folks who, once they make their border crossing, they make a payment to their smuggler for that border crossing. And with the low GTO dropping down to $200, it might catch some drug smugglers. I think that was the way it was written, was really focused on drug cartels, and certainly, wiping out cartels as an honorable goal. It will also likely catch some folks who were making the migrant smuggling payments. But I think it's important, that's just one method of payment. The peer-to-peer payments are certainly, those are another way that migrants are paying for smugglers. So it's going to catch up other types of crimes. But since it's focused on that southwest border, there's certainly a chance that migrant smuggling payments will be detected at a lower dollar value than they might have before not have hit the radar of law enforcement.
From traditional banks, what sort of typologies or footprints would they look for human smuggling? I know it's been an issue for more than just this GTO, obviously, but that'll be one question. And then, are any of the payments done in crypto and Venmo? Is it all cash? Well, what do experts think right now, or is it not too early because it's been going on for a while, but it's not enough data to make a conclusion on that?
So first, talking about what a bank might see, a traditional financial institution, that's where you might have the money mule accounts, where or the funnel accounts, where there's migrants that are coming across in a group of 40, but then once they get to the United States, some are going to Chicago, some are coming to Florida, some are staying in Texas, and they'll receive one person. The funnel account will receive cash deposits into their account at 17 different bank branches across the country. So those funnel accounts are something that banks can detect through their transaction monitoring. It might not be clear whether this is drug money, which could also use that same typology, or human smuggling. But if you see, transportation costs, hotel costs, again, that's a little confusing of, is this human trafficking versus human smuggling? But, the goal of AML is to alert law enforcement information that, some sort of suspicious activity is going on. So it might be that this is clearly an unusual scenario in this funnel account, but whether it's human smuggling, human trafficking, or drug trafficking might be a bit unclear without some additional information. I do go into more detail in a couple of my articles I've written about banks specifically. But your second question, it's not just banks, the peer-to-peer, a lot of folks have their family members pay on their behalf, their brother, cousin, wife, someone is here first, and they'll do a peer-to-peer transaction. So the use of cash may not be capturing a lot of other type of payment methods.
We'll make sure that your articles are in the show notes for this too, so folks can take a look at that, or on your LinkedIn page, where, and so that they can do that. I'm going to come back to you again on the sextortions. I want to hear what you have to say about that. Steve, you were referencing before that what you've been able to do in the cannabis space, you've also used some of the same analysis in the digital asset space. Talk a little bit about that, and let me preface it by saying, as we all three of us know, this particular Congress and administration are looking at whether or not traditional banks and other financial institutions are discriminating against crypto companies. They're calling it debanking. I'd still like it as de-risking because that shows there's some actual risk analysis. And there's obviously been some support from this administration on cryptocurrency and companies. This, I'm understating it, of course. But what does your analysis do for people that are trying just to figure out the landscape? Like Cannabis, you're not making a decision pro or con. You're giving them the information. Talk a bit about that and what you've been able to put together.
Yeah, it's the wheel works similarly in crypto as it does with cannabis. And again, really the similarities are that they're opaque merging industries. You kind of coming from the ether out of nothing. So just like we wrote an ACAMS Day article defining marijuana-related businesses, I'm not particularly creative, so I wrote an article defining digital asset-related businesses, and it was probably 70% the same, where we used a very similar taxonomy to define what, we call them digital asset businesses because crypto is kind of a type of digital asset, and there are others like NFTs and real world tokenized real world assets, which are all digital assets. So it starts with, what are we talking about, right? Basic definitions, classifications, rubric to outline a framework, not perfect, meant to be a framework by which CRB Monitor thinks about, how do I build a database? How do we categorize? How do we sort? How do we filter? Because just to say everything's a digital asset or crypto business doesn't help. For example, the concept of VASP is a very specific definition. It's a very specific type of business, which is different than the digital asset itself. And there are also digital asset businesses that aren't VASPs that banks still want to know about. So software firms and hardware firms that sell into the mining companies and the exchanges, et cetera, et cetera. So we basically use a very similar approach to define and classify the types of digital assets. And then this is actually all driven by our clients. Again, these are my big bank cannabis clients saying, hey, can you help us think through and define and identify crypto-related businesses? So basically today we do two things. Number one is we identify and monitor all publicly traded securities that are crypto-related or digital asset-related. That includes both the operating businesses, this concept of the VASP, like a Coinbase, for example, publicly traded in a pretty middle-of-fair way. Yeah, we all agree. There's degrees of separation. And we also track 600 ETPs, exchange-traded products, that hold digital assets, where they hold digital asset businesses, where they hold a combination of both. So a lot of financial institutions are saying, well, I have no exposure whatsoever to digital assets. And we're like, well, what about these 84 ETFs that you hold? Like, well, that's an ETF. That's not a digital asset. I'm like, well, it's made up entirely of digital assets. Therefore, it is just a bucket of digital assets. Right? Sure. Interesting. So that's on the public markets side of things. And then interestingly, on another side, this is less AML, more finance, but banks, really, this doesn't happen in the US today. But banks that hold crypto assets on their balance sheets, there's prudential regulatory capital calculations that they have to calculate for how much they reserve against digital assets. So this gets pretty wonky, but it depends on the nature of the digital asset. And there's a whole Basel definition, and the US doesn't love Basel, so we're going to create our own kind of definitions. So those are the kind of two main products we help today. It's like, hey, what's your exposure to publicly traded securities that are in the crypto realm? And what do they do? Who are they? Who owns them? Have they got in trouble? Are they regulated? Then there's this concept of regulatory capital, where we analyze each digital asset itself and determine which bucket, which capital relevant bucket that it falls into for a bank that holds it. And this is our European clients that actually hold this stuff today, but that will happen in the US.
So when you shared with me, and I apologize, I've been looking to the side because I have it on my right here, the slide that has the relative risk ratings of the digital asset regulators. So that's sort of what you're talking about, right? So you've taken a look based on either capital requirements or other guardrails in various amounts of countries here, and just looking real quick, got Vietnam, China, Ukraine, all these countries, so people can take a look at what you've come up with and give them a sense of what other jurisdictions are doing regarding oversight. I mean, and based on all the metrics that you referred to, right?
Yeah, thank you for bringing it up. That's kind of an output of all the work we're doing when we're analyzing all of these businesses and exchanges, like who regulates them, how real is that regulation? Again, kind of similar to my cannabis. Is like, okay, the state's regulated, but do they really regulate? Do they really enforce? Do they have AML considerations, right?
Right.
So yeah, we analyzed, I think, 60 countries and kind of risk rated them based off a number of characteristics about, is it in fact, a truly regulated country where this VASP is operating?
And that information, or at least some of that, could be available on your website, written by you and your colleagues.
It is. That specific one is a nice long blog, but yeah, we're constantly refining that, especially as we talk to clients to say, well, here are these other factors that we utilize as we're analyzing it. But yes.
Alison, coming back to you, you're very active on LinkedIn. I find your postings extremely valuable, but I've noticed, I noticed recently you focus on a lot of different things, but you've talked about the issue of sextortion. Tell us a bit about, sort of define that, and also, in terms of data recommendations, that sort of thing. Obviously, I have a general idea of what that includes, but for our audience, give us both the premise and some of the things that you and colleagues are working on to address that issue.
Sure. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to talk about this, because it's so important. I have a hard time not talking about it. So I'm specifically focused on financially motivated sextortion of children. So sextortion is when an offender threatens to release intimate images, nudes of someone. The financial sextortion is, I will not release these photos if you pay me. And then the final component is, these are intimate images of children. The child connected with someone on Snapchat or Instagram. They thought it was someone their own age. The conversation gets flirty. They exchange intimate images. But it turns out the bad guy on the other end is a transnational organized crime individual, usually based in Nigeria, Ivory Coast, maybe the Philippines, who are targeting children just to get that image. And then as soon as they get that image, they immediately, within minutes, go to blackmailing the child for money, saying, pay me $300, pay me $1,000. I need it right now. I'm going to share this image with all your friends who I saw on your social media profile. And they'll even put together a collage. Here's all your people on your baseball team. Here's your schoolmates. Here's your parents. We'll share these pictures with your parents. It's very immediate, threatening, emotionally devastating for these kids. And, part of what drew me to it is there's been about 45 suicides of teenage boys, and it is targeting specifically teenage boys. And that's just within the past 3 years. And those are the ones we know about. I just got a message yesterday about a mother who thinks their child, who's 13, committed suicide because of this. They haven't been able to get into the phone yet, and asking for resources, how to even get into the phone to know if that's why. But putting back on my economist hat, my anti-money laundering hat, this is a financial crime. The bad guys are doing this to get money. So we have a role here. I can do something. You can do something. Steve can spread the word, making sure first financial institutions know about this crime. It's I make the analogy, I didn't know much about, I'm going to use the word pig butchering. I know that's controversial these days, but the industrial level romance scams, I didn't know much about it in 2022. And then it's just kind of percolated, and you realize how widespread this is and how impactful. And I think sextortion is kind of, we're just snowballing on getting the attention of the financial institutions that these transactions are going through your institution. And that's something I've been working on, doing it kind of like Steve, doing a typology of how do the victims pay? How do the extorters consolidate and move money? Because the dollar values per victim are pretty low, $375, $1,000. and it might not trigger a transaction monitoring scenario because it is low. We'll talk about that. That's something I would love to get all the brain power in this industry to think about. How do we focus on that? But first, you have to be aware that this is a problem that's happening. So we're kind of at the base level of raising the alarm that's happening, and then thinking about how do we retool our transaction monitoring for accounts that are marketed to children, the peer-to-peer that are teen accounts. If you are a teenager who has a job at your local grocery store bagging groceries and you have to have a checking account, that's usually open, with a adult sponsor. So what transactions that happen in a teen account are unusual or weird? And then even the gift card and gaming platforms, that's where a lot of the extortion is done through. The second most demanded type of payment is through gift cards. So how do all these different industry players start becoming attuned to this as a crime that's happening? And it's so emotionally and impactful, but the dollar values just are not eye-popping for a typical transaction monitoring system that's looking at adult dollar thresholds versus $75 is everything to this kid, and the bad guys are targeting tens and hundreds of thousands of kids with this scheme. So they're collecting plenty of money, but through small amounts across a wide array of victims.
I think the parallels would be over a decade ago, human trafficking was not a space that the financial industry, not that they didn't pay attention to, but really didn't think they had any opportunities. And this is back when I was back with ACAMS. We got a bunch of bankers from several banks to work with HSI at that time and come up for the first set of typologies and transactional footprints that we all know very well today. But it was all about, at that point, outreach, and it really came from the ground up. It came from compliance officers in Columbus, Ohio, telling their bank leadership, hey, we got to do something in this space. So I
agree. Once you hear about this crime, you're like, I cannot let this go. I need to tell everyone. I don't have all the answers, but I want more folks to come together to work on this horrible problem, because the Snapchat actually did a survey of young adults, and about 1 out of every 3 has been targeted for this scheme. That doesn't mean they all exchanged pictures, but 1 out of 7 children, age 4th grade to 12th grade, has shared an intimate photo with a stranger they met online. It's shocking. It's different from how we grew up, and I really feel for the kids these days. And if you have that exchange with someone who has nefarious purposes, can go really badly, really quickly, and it's just below the radar right now for law enforcement, for parents, for financial institutions. Social media they have gotten the brunt of the attention, both from law enforcement, from parents, from legislator, but the financial industry is a little bit slower to catch on to this. Is something we have a stake in to, slowing it down.
Well, we'll definitely work with you to continue to provide this information out there. Before I ask you the follow-up, Steve, anything you want to add to that? Obviously, it's all data-driven, and Alison's doing tremendous work in highlighting that. But before I get you guys out of here and your final question, I just want to give you a chance. Anything you want to add to that?
No, that's been a lot of bit outside our current wheelhouse. So then going and watching my sister speak and supporting her,
right.
That's not quite our wheelhouse.
No, I understand. So, Steve, I'll start with you. We're in the early months of 2025, and in the States, there's a whole sorts of executive orders and other things. The CTA is not going to include domestic companies anytime soon, and obviously there'll be challenges to all that. But not asking you to opine on the politics, but if folks are calling your company and calling you and say, hey, Steve, we're just trying to figure out for the remaining part of 2025 and going forward what we should focus on. And I'll prejudice your answer this way. I asked a banker that just the other day, and that particular banker said, we're not changing anything. We're not going to overreact. We're still going to do the blocking and tackling and make sure, that leadership doesn't cut our resources. And, obviously that sounds great. You hope that happens. But again, I'm calling you. I'm a compliance officer. I'm trying to figure out what to tell my management. What do you tell them? Again, we can't predict what's going to happen, but just in general, what do you tell them both to be aware of and maybe some recommendations?
Yeah, I'll keep it to my kind of 2 lanes of expertise. And In cannabis, not much. It's kind of status quo.
Okay.
Basically, in cannabis, one area in cannabis that is of increasing interest and, frankly, increasing risk is hemp-derived intoxicating products. So these are THC and CBD beverages and that are derived from hemp, not from marijuana, which are quasi-legal from state to state. Various states are clamping down on hemp-derived intoxicating products, Tennessee, Texas, and others. And marijuana is the new administration is just focused on so many other things that I don't think marijuana cannabis has come up anywhere at all. But who knows? In terms of rescheduling or safer banking, kind of the hot keywords you've been hearing in that space for the past couple of years, I just don't expect much. I don't expect many banks to come into the space. I don't know. Some might be exiting because it's actually fairly well banked now. I know it's not like banking a federally legal industry. I actually think this year is going to be quiet as it relates to cannabis banking. Crypto, basically, given the kind of shift change in the federal government's interest and desire to support the industry, a lot of banks are just starting to wrap their head around it. I think they've really not thought about it. It's kind of like cannabis before. Actually, it's not that great, but an example. But a lot of banks, U.S. banks, just haven't thought about it. They're like, can't do it, won't do it, not going to think about it. So now we're starting to hear banks think about it, right? They're reading our articles, like explain to me how do you think about these things. We had one or two interesting calls last week with some very big banks and custody banks, and they're like, well, publicly we're very crypto, but in the back end, the head of compliance is like, we're not going to be moving that fast. To kind of repeat what you just heard is everybody's going to say they're doing it, and they are moving relative to what they would have done if Kamala had been elected, I guess. But everybody's looking at it, kind of like they're looking at cannabis 10 years ago, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a risk there, so you have to do your regular risk assessment and risk analysis. So that makes sense. Alison, from your perspective, again, you've obviously opened our eyes to this really sad sextortion issue, but other things you've testified a number of times in front of Congress on a whole host of issues. Again, not asking you to opine on legislation, but just in general, we call you up and say, Alison, what should we be focused on for the remaining part of the year in an AML-CFT space? Just generally, what do you tell clients?
I think one area we've actually seen an increased focus is the fentanyl and drug trafficking, for example, that GTO. Right. The other really interesting thing that happened, in the first days of the administration was the naming of cartels and foreign terrorist organizations, which changes the game as far as identifying, reporting, and what does a SAR look like for terror finance for the Sinaloa cartel. And I think that's something that the financial institutions maybe caught folks off guard, and we'll have to think through how do you file that SAR, or how do you know it's a cartel? How do you not know if it's cartel? If the drug trafficking organization, when does it become terror finance related? And then if you're supporting a terror group by transporting their materials as a trucker, or selling them guns, or whatever, selling them a horse to launder the money, are you now supporting a foreign terrorist organization? So there's some thought that needs to go into how are we going to analyze this differently, because that is one area we've seen a lot of rollback of attention in other areas. That's one area that's gotten more attention. So thinking about the drug trafficking, fentanyl, terrorism classification.
Oh, I appreciate that, and obviously that's important as we look at the formally issued priorities. That's a clear priority given what's happening, and like you said, those executive orders. Alison Jimenez and Steve Kemmerling, I want to thank you so much for sharing your insights today, and more importantly, the work that you're doing for our community, which is so invaluable, both information, outreach, and obviously advice and counsel. So thank you so much, and we'll make sure that folks that listen to this and watch this, they know where to go for more information on CRB Monitor's webpage and some of the articles and analysis done there. And of course, Alison, like I said, you're somebody that people should be following on LinkedIn if they're not already, because of all the insight that you present on a whole host of issues. We didn't have really time today to talk about what happens with various humanitarian groups when we're dealing with CFT issues and obviously get harmed by that. But that's also something that you've opined on, and I'd ask folks to take a look at that. So again, thank you guys. I really appreciate it. Stay safe, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you, John.
So much.